Hey, Cypher here. I'm adding chapters to my dissertation to eventually turn into a book, one of which will be on the Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857. I plan on making a few episodes about Mormon history to get the creative juices flowing on that. So I got excited when a big edutuber made a couple of episodes on Mormon history. Johnny Harris is most famous for his map videos and extremely well-produced visuals. He is a former member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, LDS for short, so I kinda expected a unique perspective that's useful for prospective learners. Unfortunately, I've noticed a downward trend on his channel, and these were exemplary of that, making for something that will hurt viewers' understanding of this history. So this is a response video. I want to show what went wrong here, not to berate Harris or anything, but to illustrate the disservice this narrative does for people who seek education on this topic, along with perhaps showing a means to improve if Harris ever watches this video. So do not try to make this into some dramatic flame war between channels. It is not. I may get exasperated at times throughout this recording, partially because the air conditioner had to be turned off and it's already getting hot in here, but understand that it is from a place of genuine constructive criticism. I make plenty of mistakes myself and took years to figure out how to run my channel. Now, I always include a space for admitting mistakes in the pinned comment and description. You'll find something I screwed up in every couple of videos, and I channel favorite the comments that point it out first, though admittedly those are often typically inconsequential. What I'm talking about today is a narrative problem that seems to be growing worse. Firstly, I know he has a team behind him, so the problem is likely not Harris himself. But more importantly, this is not a derogatory denunciation. I'm pointing out an issue that plagues many other edutubers and how to improve. Harris is an edutuber and therefore should be held to a higher standard than someone without an educational mission. Something like drunk history isn't meant for learning. They're just telling cool stories, and extremely poorly at that. Why is it making my shoulder disappear? Education requires an intent to teach, to facilitate learning about the topic you are covering, and I believe Harris wants to do that. So he has a duty to his viewers to improve in a way that encourages continued learning beyond his channel. As we go along, there will be some interesting details about Mormon history that may debunk some misconceptions you, dear viewer, may incidentally hold. So let's learn something about how history is made, because the main problem here is that in an attempt to simplify information into a consumable format, Harris crushed necessary context out of the narrative to the point of making it incomprehensible to those who already understand, and concealing that knowledge to others who seek it. Johnny Harris makes some of the best visuals in the business. He's genuinely driven the graphical side of EduTube to greater heights than most of us could hope to achieve, which makes it all the more disappointing to find him using ugly AI imagery. Generative AI isn't necessarily bad, but there is so much actual imagery to use that would produce a better understanding of the time. Those come when he's talking about the context surrounding Joseph Smith's religiosity, before he began the Church of Latter-day Saints. What he's trying to describe here is the Second Great Awakening, something that some of his sources directly explain, but Harris describes it with a series of unclear platitudes.
For reformist religions that were replacing old-style authoritarian-type churches. It was unprecedented times. America felt special and different. Revolution in the new world, new science, magical technology, new ideas, both wholesome and sinful, all of it speeding up at an increasing rate.
Though I've published a lecture on the Second Great Awakening, let's briefly explain it to get a sense of what Harris is missing here. The United States was founded on Enlightenment values, which emphasized a secular government formed through a social contract rather than religious piety, hence the Constitution and quick disestablishment of numerous state denominations. Many Americans felt that the new country had gone too far astray from their religion. Several revival movements began in the early 19th century, attempting to bring Christianity back to what they thought were its primitive origins, devoid of centuries worth of corruption, modernization, and secularization. Joseph Smith grew up in an area where the fiery rhetoric and attempted utopias were so commonplace, people called Western New York the burned-over district. That is why he was so religious. That was shorter than Harris's explanation and yet more complete, including the necessary context to comprehend the Second Great Awakening's importance. This also renders a repeated claim throughout Harris's first video confounding, if not false. He says,
Father who wasn't really religious at all. He's this uneducated, unreligious treasure hunter.
That makes Smith seem more miraculous than any serious history should show. He was surrounded by religion. His mother was an evangelical, and his father was superstitious, just not a direct follower of any specific religion, though he attended many revivals. In fact, Smith Sr. was the one who started Junior on treasure hunting, proving that superstitious connection to folk magic. Unlike what Harris says,
but at the time, mystical visions and treasure hunting and seer stones, this was all very normal in society.
No, this was very much fringe. Otherwise, New York and Pennsylvania authorities wouldn't have tried to punish Smith on multiple occasions for fraud. He says this again.
This was all trending at the time. This was not surprising. But a lot of this stuff was totally new, wild fringe doctrine.
During that sequence, he talks about Smith's emerging theology, but once again, it is poorly constructed. You can actually see the works he's referencing on screen, and he's combining a bunch of stuff from several years apart. Now, if he was simply trying to say that LDS had a lot of strange beliefs built up over a decade, then sure. But a later sequence about changing theology proves that incorrect.
And meanwhile, Joseph is getting more and more and more of these revelations.
This is too much of an effort at compression without implying the nuances left behind. All these mistakes could have been avoided by implying nuance with quick asides, indefinite adjectives, and hinting at a larger complexity. You should not imply that all of this happened at once when it did not. The rest of this first video blazes through time in a bewildering amount of decontextualization. He says that Smith left Kirtland because he got tarred and feathered by anti-Mormon haters.
They're telling him to leave, and he does.
No, that was perpetrated by disgruntled Mormons in 1832, 5 years before he left Kirtland. That's longer than the Civil War. Smith left because his bank failed in 1837. The Missouri War is incomprehensible because of Harris's discombobulation, where he says it's locals sabotaging LDS.
They want the Mormons out, so they start sabotaging them with violence.
This completely misses the fact that there was violence between Mormons and Gentiles in 1833 and 34 Missouri before Smith even arrived. And Smith came under arms in 1834, calling his personal militia Zion's Camp. Despite Smith's provocation and contrary to Harris,
the next 5 years are years of conflict for Joseph and his growing church.
No, there was peace until 1838. Missouri granted Caldwell County to Mormons, but soon they overflowed elsewhere, leading to new attempts to expel them. Governor Boggs had taken part in the initial expulsions, so he was happy to support them again, hence the Missouri War. This is necessary to explain, but Harris jumps right to Nauvoo, where we get the final whopper of this video. He says this.
And it's in Nauvoo where Joseph says that an angel appeared to him and demanded multiple times against his will that he take on multiple wives.
Firstly, Smith had likely practiced polygamy as early as Kirtland. In fact, Harris shows Fanny Alger, who was likely his first plural wife, in 1836 Kirtland, 2 years before the Missouri War altogether. That polygamy revelation came in 1842, and he definitely practiced polygamy before that. Clearly, Smith wanted more wives. Yet, again, this is because of poorly compressed history, but at least the end of this video is introspective and makes some good points. So the first episode wasn't too bad, but the second made me realize that this problem needed to be addressed. I pretty quickly sensed that the second episode was going to be worse. He called the American frontier the Wild West.
Here in the Wild West.
I have an episode about why that is a term that historians avoid, and anyone trying to communicate history should do the same, so as not to compound the old myth and all the death, destruction, and oppression it plasters over. Then he does this.
For a state of their own, something that would lead them into a war with the United States government.
That picture was the Mountain Meadows Massacre, definitely not war with the US government. Also, the proposed state of Deseret was long dead by that time. This one is a lot worse, often incomprehensibly smashing decades together, not just years, but decades, and disregarding extremely important context. For the first 10 minutes of this, Harris pretends that LDS moved to Utah without knowing it was within the United States.
They found safety in the mountains of Mexico. But for now, they would build Zion in the mountains of Mexico, far away from the American government and people. 1848. Thanks to a victory against Mexico, the US gets all of this land here. This was still the Wild West. But there was a big problem for the Mormons, which is that this was all now the United States.
Now, it is true that they began the move with that intent, but by the time they arrived at the Great Salt Lake in 1847, Brigham Young and his followers knew full well that Mexico would be losing that land. They had even sent a battalion to California to help with the conquest, which gets no mention whatsoever in this, even if Mormons were foolish enough, and to be clear, they were not, to be under the inordinately false impression that moving to this forgotten and unsettled corner of Mexican territory would be simply allowed without caveat. For the first time in Mexican history, they would have been disabused of that notion within a year of the first group arriving with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That being said, Young wanted to rule the Great Basin as his own fiefdom, saying, "No officer of the United States should ever dictate to him in this valley, or he would hang them on a gibbet as a warning to others." But he would not be entitled to such an insurrection, as clearly articulated by the US Constitution. Unlike what Harris implies here, Mormons were not guaranteed autonomy from the American government, and should not have expected otherwise. Yet Harris speaks about mining during this supposed Mexican period.
They were mining metals. They were very productive.
Firstly, those are pictures of non-Mormon miners. They largely did not mine in Utah, leaving that to Gentiles, though there were failed attempts in Iron County and at Lead in Las Vegas. Secondly, the Mormon battalion did engage in mining as some of the first Argonauts of the California Gold Rush, a distinctly American affair, but those who didn't apostatize left quickly to come to Utah. He also says this.
They were doing things that no one else was doing out in the West. They were building sophisticated ditches and canals and reservoirs.
Wow, that is ignoring New Mexico altogether, which has acequias from more than 2 centuries prior, let alone the oldest cities inside the United States, which have been continuously occupied for a millennium, long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Ignoring Hispanic settlements and pueblos is one thing, but what he says about indigenous peoples of Utah in the name of crushing history down is unacceptable. He says,
and displacing native people in a lot of cases, sometimes peacefully with treaties, but other times with violence.
Sometimes? While yes, Mormons were remarkably better with local tribes in Utah than Americans were elsewhere, that ignores the numerous wars Mormons fought against them nonetheless, including one of the worst massacres in the entire Indian Wars, in which the US Army, guided by Porter Rockwell himself, slaughtered roughly 250 Shoshones at Bear River in 1863. That's worse than Mountain Meadows. Here's a list of the Utah Indian Wars, most of which were majority Mormons doing the fighting. During the earliest conflicts in Utah, Brigham Young was fairly explicitly genocidal, saying in 1850, "We shall have no peace until the men are killed off. Let the women and children live if they will behave themselves." Mormons may have been less violent than other Americans, but they were still incredibly brutal. Sometimes with violence is not the phrase someone should use if they're trying to effectively communicate history. That smashes multitudes into pablum, effectively denying prospective learners necessary education. I get they simply want to avoid talking about these terrible events, but whoever's the scriptwriter here needs to work on their prose. Also, I've got to point out that he states that the temple was almost instantly placed in Utah.
Very soon after arriving, Brigham Young sent members of the church north and south to repeat the same pattern, putting the temple in the middle, and begin developing and settling this land.
They did set out a temple square, but no. The first one in Utah was in St. George, completing in 1877. Salt Lake City's wasn't completed until 1892, long after this period that he is talking about. And the tabernacle wasn't opened until 1867. The building that they used for rituals and rites was basically a shack at that point. So it makes no sense to show Brigham Young speaking there in 1852.
Prophet Brigham Young stands at the pulpit of this very beautiful building and tells the members of the church that plural marriage or polygamy is a divine law from God.
The old tabernacle, which the current one replaced, and was demolished in 1877 to make room for the assembly hall, was still under construction at the time of the announcement, and certainly didn't appear like the current one, being made quickly and dangerously out of adobe. Young would have made that announcement at the council house, which was mostly for secular purposes. The weird crushing of time makes Harris jump about the timeline, complaining that the government said no to Utah statehood because they hated Mormons.
And they lobbied hard for their state. And the US government said absolutely not. Of course not. The government didn't love that the Mormons were building this theocratic society.
That is simply an LDS myth, born from misplaced spite. 10,000 people were in Utah by 1850, and their proposal laughably included chunks of New Mexico and California, which they absolutely did not control. In order to become a state at that point, there must have been 60,000 citizens and clear sovereignty granted by the federal government, neither of which Deseret had. Harris should have spoken about the Compromise of 1850.
A compromise of 1850.
New Mexico had the population it needed, but Texas had to be placated. As a result, Utah was just an afterthought. Young got to remain governor because the federal government didn't care enough to replace him. Territories are not sovereign like states, so governors serve at the behest of the federal government. And because of that, they somehow got the right to legalize slavery, which they absolutely shouldn't since it was above the Missouri line. And of course, they did exactly that in 1852, the same year Young announced in front of that non-existent beautiful building that polygamy was part of LDS's doctrine. The Compromise of 1850 and Utah slavery is not something to simply skip over. So then he shows what he calls
in this waterfall of political cartoons.
It wasn't so quick, considering all the cartoons he shows here are from after the Civil War, something that hadn't happened yet in this narrative. Plus, acting outraged about this comic is a bad look.
But you also see some more violent and dehumanizing depictions, like Uncle Sam marching with his sword into Utah, the Mormon vermin nest, or lines of women marching into a skull labeled Utah.
I don't think he noticed that Mountain Meadows sign in the corner. He gives a terrible explanation of that massacre later.
A group of the Mormon militia happen upon a group of settlers who are traveling to California. They have a standoff, and eventually the Mormons end up tricking them into coming out and giving them their guns, at which point they go on to massacre almost the entire group, 120 men, women, and children. Only a handful of children were spared, and they were the ones who were too young to remember what was happening. But despite this increased tension...
Luckily, I've already recorded a better version of that for a different episode. A wagon train mostly from Arkansas met steady resistance as they traveled through Utah in 1857. This was during heightened tensions as the federal government launched an expedition to quash Mormon resistance just after a major religious reformation took place a year prior, and the outlying settlements remained highly excited due to regular fights to gain favor with tribes. Once the train reached southern Utah, local Mormons chose to lead local Paiutes on a raid against them. But once a few escapees discovered the Mormon involvement, militia and church leaders, being Isaac Haight, William Dame, and John Higbee, chose to eliminate the train altogether. Leader John D. Lee came under a flag of truce to the Fancher Party, the wagon train, and coaxed them from their fortifications, but betrayed them. The Mormon militia of Iron County, also known as the Nauvoo Legion, attacked, killing 120 and leaving only 17 children, none older than 7. The Mormon Church long denied any involvement and only offered Lee up for execution after 2 decades of sheltering the perpetrators. The church line was that it was only Lee's wickedness who somehow led only Paiutes, despite the official church militia, or Nauvoo Legion, perpetrating the massacre. That resistance to federal authority I'm talking about there is referring to them preventing territorial officials from doing their job. The Utah War wasn't some random decision like Harris depicts it.
Mormon leaders start defending polygamy, saying that it's a healthier way of life. Eventually, the federal government has had enough. They see this as an open rebellion happening within their borders. And that's when they call in the troops.
It was the U.S. Army coming to depose Brigham Young as a governor after he'd used his secular and spiritual position of authority to flout federal requirements. Young was exceptionally tyrannical, even for a Western territorial governor. Listing the number of Young's infractions from 1850 to 57 would be nearly unending, but in particular, there was ruling as a theocratic dictator, driving officials away, sending vigilantes to attack fur trappers, changing criminal jurisdiction to probate courts, preventing apostates from leaving through debt collection and violence, supposedly having a judge murdered, professing a doctrine of blood atonement, aligning tribes against the government, and constantly declaring autonomy from federal laws. None of those were about polygamy, since there was no federal law against it. That was left up to the states. Concern over polygamy certainly fueled President Buchanan's interest in replacing Young, but it was not the reason for the Utah War. The reason was Young declaring his independence from federal jurisdiction. A clear insurrectionary statement from a governor. Harris's entire story completely disintegrates when you understand those details, unwittingly forcing oblivious viewers into ignorance. The expedition is largely seen as a mistake by historians, but it certainly wasn't just some random decision. Then there's one last ridiculous compression where he says,
They pass a series of laws that make polygamy or anything like it illegal.
The Morrill Act was 1862, the Poland Act in 74, the Edmunds Act in 82, and finally the Edmunds-Tucker Act in 1887. These should be explained in at least a graphic, not reducing 2.5 decades of history into a single sentence as though it were merely a couple of years. This all serves to make a nonsensical grievance-mongering narrative where the big mean federal government wouldn't let innocent LDS live their superior lives, oppressing them at every turn. I'm not even sure if that's what Harris intended. Crushing context out of the narrative is bewildering and only hurts people's understanding of history. So he specifically says to scrutinize his sources.
And as always, my sources are in a document in the description. Please scrutinize and critique them if you don't agree.
Well, let's look at them. That's sad. These are only footnotes, something I always include in the video itself. There is no bibliography or explanation of how his interpretation came about. He knows the difference between bibliography and footnotes. There's only a few times in this response that I found clear false statements, and in neither of these lists does it address those falsehoods. And most of this is composed of unnecessary side stories. Plus, since these are more endnotes than actual footnotes, that renders the majority of this text utterly wasteful. If this were a book or an article, 90% of this document would get cut for superfluous digressions, with little to no connection to the timestamps referenced. In fact, this is basically an appendix, rather than what Harris calls
My sources are in a document in the description. Please scrutinize and critique them if you don't agree.
That is not a challenge you want to issue with this document. So I'm left trying to understand how all this crushed context happened. But without a bibliography, I can only guess from the footnotes, which in the second video are largely just pop history websites and official church studies. I see Bagley's Blood of the Prophets in there for Mountain Meadows Massacre. Great book, but that doesn't explain why he screwed up the explanation so badly. Bagley, thus far, has the best historiography section of any Mountain Meadows book. Alongside this, it mentions the church-sponsored books, but not that they were church-sponsored, which both state that in their introductions. There's a few articles referenced, but only saying that something happened. You don't need to reference anything if it is already a well-established fact, which is called common knowledge. Wait, am I pointing in the right direction? Nope. Here's a diatribe I made about that and its issues. Most of these footnotes are about common knowledge. This is why I put footnotes in the video and a bibliography below. Plus, bibliographies grant viewers not just an opportunity to interrogate the sources of your interpretation, but also show a blueprint of where to go for further learning. These are standards that I've simply ported from regular scholarly work, something Harris's team would see in every one of these books and articles, including the church websites, because LDS has a commendable history department. I know journalists use the inferior MLA standard compared to our Chicago style, but this doesn't conform to either of those. Yeah, I said it. CMS is better than APA and MLA. We got proper footnotes, none like those parenthetical crap. How about this? You can write all the news and social studies you want, but historians get the last say 50 years from now. Don't get on our bad side because we control your memory and legacy. Jokes aside, the main takeaway is that Harris and other edutubers like him need to elevate their storytelling. By trying to compress time, creators shouldn't crush context out. There's ways of showing nuance and not forcing viewers to ignore important events and trends that show the full breadth of the topic. This is why I said you should imply nuance with quick asides, indefinite adjectives, and hinting at a larger complexity. You don't necessarily have to go into everything, but you do have to imply that it's there. Because there's always more complexity to history, meaning we can't talk about everything. Trust me, I get plenty of the "you forgot to mention" comments too. First, to those miscreants, learn what an omission is. Second, most of them aren't even something that actually happened or matters to the narrative. But more importantly, I go out of my way to tell a story that viewers can realize my omissions. That's why I avoid superlatives. Instead of saying this is the first or the most or the best or the worst or whatever, I tend to say one of the best or one of the worst, one of the first. You know, anything to imply that there's more. And if anything, we should emphasize that. History tubers must cautiously avoid presenting interpretations that render viewers no longer able to go beyond our own videos. We should always strive to communicate history in a way that facilitates continued learning. And I know Harris can make great videos. He's just gotta put tighter controls on his team in order to avoid such incomprehensible messes like these. I've spoke with several fellow history tubers about him, and they all seem to have given up on his channel as a whole. But I honestly believe he's capable of improving. He didn't used to include sources, now he does. Just not well. He now irregularly talks about interpretation. His visuals are still top-notch, at a level that my Luddite skills are incapable of. If he didn't crush the context out of this, I wouldn't bother making a response. But as I begin covering the same events in a chapter of my book, I see something like this and realize there will be thousands of people now ignorant of the context that matters to telling this story. It hurts them, and it hurts my ability to speak to them. Eventually, I have to make my own episodes on this topic, and I hope that viewers aren't hindered by exposure to reductive social media.